Hello, and welcome to My Favorite Games, a podcast for game designers to geek out about games they love to play. Today, I'm super excited to host Keith Matejka. Keith is a game designer, game publisher, and avid gamer out of Madison, Wisconsin. He's the owner and designer of Thunderworks Games and loves heavy music and anything darkly geeky. Keith, thank you so much for coming on and welcome.
Yeah, happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
I noticed you said heavy music and not heavy metal music.
That is interesting. Yeah, so I mean, not all. I like
heavy metal, but with weight.
Yeah,
with like.
Yeah, so like
with meaning.
I like things that are dark, and I like metal for sure. But I actually like anything that is like, I like things that are really complicated, like that. I like progressive metal, and I like progressive rock and stuff like that too. And I also like things that are emotional, right? So things that have like a dark emotion, or just kind of really kind of affect me emotionally. That's really stuff that I dig. So yeah, I mean,
okay.
I've played music all my life. I have a bachelor's in music, and I worked in a recording studio for a while in California. So and played in bands most of my life. So music is a big part of who I am. So yeah.
Cool. So I mean, heaviness is actually then quite fitting.
Right, there you go.
So you come from background in music, but then before this, you were also in the video games industry. I'm counting all of the big entertainment industries there. How did that transition happen, especially from like the video game industry to what you're doing now?
So like, I started out in music, really playing in bands. I went to school for music, got a gig in a recording studio in Menlo Park, California, and I was working on. They were doing a lot of video game voiceover projects at the recording studio, so that was kind of like my kind of segue into video games. I've always wanted to do things in my life that I have a passion for, and music was one of them, and then video games were another one, and so that. The transition from working in a recording studio and music and working in video games was purely financial, right? So I was living in California, that is a very expensive place to live, and I just had to get a gig that like actually paid something better. So that's why I transitioned into video games, and then actually I ended up climbing the ladder there because I was working for Konami, who at the time were really well known for their music games. So I ended up kind of working on a bunch of music games like Dance Dance Revolution, and I worked on a bunch of singing games called Karaoke Revolution. And so then my career progressed. I was doing video game stuff. I moved to a developer here in Madison, Wisconsin called Raven Software. And then moving from publishing to development, there's a lot more kind of gamers, right? There's not just like marketing people and sales people and publishing. Now we're in development, and we've got artists and game designers and all those kind of folk, and they're much more into just playing games. And because I moved from California to Wisconsin, I was looking for something to kind of meet new people, and one of those things was I decided to start playing board games. There were 3 games that kind of transitioned me from video games into board games. One of the moments was I had a friend who was he was Puerto Rican, and he heard this game Puerto Rico was number 1 on this website that he just found called BoardGameGeek.com, and he wanted to play Puerto Rico because at the time it was the number 1 game on BGG, and we just went to a random store and bought it and played it all weekend. So that was kind of my entry into Euro games. And then I was also playing lots of RPGs when I was in college. I moved back to Wisconsin. My friends wanted to start playing D&D and Vampire again, but I started playing with them again, but as an adult versus being a college student, I suddenly found I didn't have as much kind of free time to spend 12 hours playing D&D. So I was looking for similar experiences, and that's where I found Descent First Edition and like Arkham Horror Second Edition. And so those were kind of like D&D adjacent titles where I could have a similar role-playing experience, but not as much of a time commitment. Now those games can be long when you think about in the world of board games, but compared to an RPG, they're a much more limited experience. Um, and then the third one was it was just the desire to meet people, and got into groups, started playing brand new games, opened up this world of board games to me. So I was working this new job at at a video game developer, and I was playing lots of board games and kind of this. I'm sure most gamers, board gamers, know that like when they kind of when the Pandora's box opens of learning about board games, you just like it's insatiable, right? You just want to play everything. There's all these brand new experiences, and they're all new and interesting, and you want to explore those things. So then I just got obsessed, listening to the Dice Tower when Tom was still in Korea. Him and Joe Stedman were kind of getting off the ground, and I just really got into it. And I worked with a bunch of people who make video games all day long. So there was this moment of the Kickstarter was just kind of kicking off. Glory to Rome had the first, like a really big campaign. It was like a landmark campaign on Kickstarter. There were a couple other big ones that had done well, and it was this new exciting thing. And the Kickstarter lowers the barrier of entry for people who've never even considered making a board game before. So I saw Jamie Stegmaier and those guys kind of exposing all the secrets in their blogs about like how do you do this thing, and kind of doing these tell-alls, and me being ignorant of what things really take to do. I said, well, why don't we make games all day long? Why don't on my lunch breaks we started, three of us who play games together, board games together. We were like, let's just make some games, with the idea that maybe one of them we would publish on Kickstarter. And then I'm kind of a tenacious dude, and so I just did that and stuck with it and learned a ton of stuff along the way. So at that point, I was making board games on the side with my day job. It was my 9 to 5. And then eventually, I'd done 3 or 4 campaigns, and the expansion for Role Player done well enough, in which I was like, you know what, I think I could kind of do this full time and kind of put this kind of video game thing on hold or leave it behind. So I did. I took the jump. I spent 6 months kind of figuring out all my finances, figuring out like what it would take to support my household if this whole board game
preparing for the dive.
Exactly. If this whole thing falls apart, let's make sure that I still have a roof over my head and everybody gets fed. And then I just cut the cord, and then there's very little net, and I went for it. So my general philosophy, and I guess maybe something that's really helped me along the way, is that I'm just very inquisitive, right? So I find I ask people lots of questions, and some of this I had this philosophy of like even when I was playing music, like I always wanted to play with people that were better than me, so that I could like level up as my own skills. I don't want to be the most talented person in the room. I want to have people around me that I can learn from, and people that kind of really have skills that I don't have. So I also find that to be true when I was started doing board game stuff. There was a lot of other people at the time kind of coming up at the same time. People had done 1 or 2 games. AJ Porfirio from Van Ryder had just done his first Kickstarter for Hostage Negotiator, and we kind of connected. And Eduardo Barat from Pencil First Games kind of was a step or two ahead of me of where I had been, and I just reach out to those guys and I just ask them questions. I go to game design events, and I basically drill people for their perceptions of how to do things, who had published a game and I hadn't, or had licensed an IP and I hadn't, just because I'm curious and I want to know. And there's all these people around you, especially in the board game world, who are happy to share, that are definitely have this like the rising tide rises all ships kind of mentality. Like the sense of competition isn't really there in a lot of ways. So people are happy to share and they want to see you succeed. That environment really allowed me to kind of come into my own and be successful with a handful of titles through Kickstarter.
I'd love to dig into those to that kind of process in terms of how you approach Kickstarter, and also how you still use Kickstarter in your process. Before that, though, let's the game that we're gonna be discussing today, or at least the game that you're bringing today, is War of the Ring, which is originally from 2004 with a second edition in 2011.
Right.
Yeah, tell me about it. Like,
Yeah.
why did you choose it? You said you got into Euro gaming a little bit because it was a shorter, more contained experience than role playing. Was War of the Ring that kind of motivation?
So definitely, War of the Ring is my favorite game of all time. And it hits.
Why?
Well, I'm about to tell you. There are some War of the Ring accomplishes some amazing things. First of all, it's an epic experience, right? Which is not all board games need to be epic experience, but I think most of the time, at least for my favorite game, I'm looking for that kind of experience, like something that's cinematic, something that has a fair amount of storytelling. And obviously, I like the movies and the novels by Tolkien. Um, and so, why that game is great, it has in my opinion, has a very strong, maybe perfect, dare I say, um, connection between theme and mechanics. Right. So it is. It does a fair amount of storytelling. There's a known story, but that isn't necessarily the story that you're going to experience. You know how it's going to start. You know how there's multiple endings, but like there's a lot of moments that kind of take the story of that path in different directions, and that's all driven by, the cards that are dealt and what order they come out and the actions of the different players. So there's, I think there's, I don't know, so genius. There's really interesting matches between the known thematic material of that story and lore, and then matching it to uh, relatively simple mechanics that just makes sense. That game is a complex game, but what makes it relatively easy to learn is that there's such a great marriage between the theme and the mechanics of that game. There's it's by default it's really a two-player game. The box says 2 to 4, but it's really a two-player game, where there's the good guys and the bad guys, and they're asymmetric. I love asymmetric games. So you can see I designed a game called Skull Hollow for Eduardo Baref at Pencil First Games that is an asymmetric game. It kind of is a kind of the shows my love for that style of game of like everybody having their own set of goals, having their own powers. You really kind of feel like an ownership of that thing. And one of the things I like most about board games, and something that I strive for in board games, is to make the player feel something, and I want them to feel either clever or powerful. And War of the Ring does both of those things. When you're Sauron and you put dice in that hunt box, and you send the ring race out to go look for the ring, and when you catch them, it feels good, and their corruption goes up, and you're like, yeah, you're really affecting that person. And then when you're playing on the inverse side, when you're playing as the Fellowship, and you're kind of bobbing and weaving, dodging around where the forces of Sauron think you are. You're kind of playing a little cat and mouse hide and seek, and when you fool them, man, you feel clever. And so that game kind of gives you both of those feelings, which I like quite a bit.
Are there certain elements? So you say that part of the brilliance of it is that it is quite a complex game, but it's filled with a lot of relatively simple and straightforward mechanics.
Right.
Is there an example of one that comes to mind that marries that like thematic appropriateness and simple right mechanic for the moment that I don't know, resonates?
The game is dice driven. You roll dice and you choose which one, and then depending on this face, you can do certain things with it. In that game, you unlock a character. So you turn as the Sauron player, you bring out the Witch King comes out, and he comes with a die, and which basically says, "I'm more powerful. I'm going to get more actions," and that's represented not only by the character but also by the die that comes with them. Which on my turn, I can use that more often. This idea that you roll the dice at the beginning of your turn as the Sauron player, and then you decide how many of these dice you want to basically dedicate to this what's called the hunt box, which is like, how many of my resources do I want to say I'm keeping an eye out for to find the Fellowship that are running around, and how much versus how many of them do I want to just keep to take action. So it's kind of like, you only have so much effort. How much do you want to dedicate to this part? How much of it do you want to dedicate to this part? The idea is that you can't, your attention is limited. So you have to decide how you want to do that, and then so that piece is I think an interesting
Feels
marriage.
super appropriate though.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure. And then there's there's a fair amount of combat in War of the Ring. Some people call it a war game. It's the most thematic war game of all time, I would say, because I mean a lot of war games are two-player, very confrontational, and this game is that dudes on a map moving from region to region. So I would say that the Hunt Box and the Sauron side is a good example of that real tight marriage.
When did you first play it?
Oh man, I mean it
Like
took me a while, right?
before you decided to design your first one,
Yeah.
or
So
had you discovered it? Yeah.
tackling War of the Ring, especially as like a new board gamer or that hadn't played a ton of games, was felt like a Herculean task. The rulebook is big, the board is massive, you've got a million pieces. So I always wanted to play it, but I was intimidated by it. That's how that goes. So probably I've been playing board games probably at least kind of actively. I mean, I played games when I was a kid, but when I was really into board games, it probably took me a couple years to play it. But it was always I love thematic games, and that was on Board Game Geeks and other websites. War of the Ring is always listed as one of the top most thematic games, so it was always on my list to play. Um, and I wish I could remember the first time I played it, but it definitely took me a couple years of getting into games, playing stuff, because as you know, as you play more games, things become familiar. You have like touch points from previous games that make new games easier to learn. Um, so it took me a while, and it's such kind of a big setup, and it's really only two players. I don't play that many two-player games. I play mainly 3 to 5 player games. So, and it's one of those games where you have to schedule it. You're like, all right, dude, on the 14th, you're gonna come to my house. I'm gonna have the game set up, and we're gonna play this game for 3 hours. Watch these videos so I don't have to teach you the whole thing. Um, so I don't play it very often, but it's an event when I do, and I always have a good time.
So how did like playing specifically, I mean, Euro games, but whatever you want to call it, if it's a war game or not, but games like, War of the Ring, how has that influenced your maybe process or approach to game design? I mean, you're the first game, at least that was launched, was Bullfrogs, right?
Right.
Which is obviously quite different.
Yeah. Right. Yes. Yes.
But did you, how has playing games, or maybe specifically that game, or has it influenced the way that you approach mechanic design or game design?
So War of the Ring in particular probably doesn't have a real direct influence on my design
Hmm.
philosophy. Um, Obviously, I love the connection between theme and mechanics, but I also the benefit of that also is that learning a game, the tighter you can keep the mechanics to the theme, it makes it easier to learn, easier to teach, harder to
Yeah.
forget important rules. And so I think that piece of it kind of carries through. But my philosophy and kind of my outlook on game design really kind of comes more from kind of more traditional Euro games, the Reiner Knizias of the world, who love simple rule sets that have that give the players lots of options. My design philosophy comes more from a focus of kind of pure, more Euro game designers, guys like Knizia, um, and he's definitely one of my favorites. And then the my favorite designer is Martin Wallace. I mean, Martin Wallace. I don't love everything he's done, but the thing that I love about his designs is that they usually take something that feels familiar, and then there's definitely a twist in there. Like this doesn't isn't gonna. There's at least one or two things that isn't gonna work the way you expect it to, and as an experienced gamer, and it makes the game really interesting. Um, so definitely, when you play a lot of board games, sometimes games start to feel samey. It's like, oh, this is from this game, this is from this game, this is from this game. So it's actually really kind of refreshing for me to play a game and be like, oh, this doesn't work like the 3 other games that have similar mechanics. this does it like in this other way, and that's really interesting. So Martin Wallace is good at that, and that's one of the reasons why I like him so much.
So then thinking about then your board game,
Sure.
design journey, there's quite a difference between falling in love with playing board games and deciding, uh, you know, that you're either capable or interested enough
Right.
or talented enough, whatever you want to call it, to actually make one yourself.
Right.
And so what prompted you to make your first title, and was the first game that you made Bullfrogs, or was that the result of a process that you went through?
Okay, so yeah, Bullfrogs was not the first game I worked on. It is the first game I published. The first game I
Published,
worked
yeah.
on was a mech combat game called Arsenal, which will probably see the light of day someday. I've started to go back to it in the last year, but so that was an interesting process. My eyes were big. I was like, I see Kickstarter, these projects, lots of minis. I'm a fool because I assume I can do anything, right? so, um, so I designed the game that I wanted to see on Kickstarter first, which was it had a bunch of miniatures in it. It had bunches of boards and tiles and player mats and lots of bits, and we had actually started going down the path of getting artwork done for it. There was a point in time, there was a turning point. Basically, kind of my relationship with the artist wasn't going that well, and some of that was probably out of my own like ignorance of like what it's like to work with artists. Um, so then there was a kind of this crossroads because I was like, okay, I got to start over. I either start over on all the art for this game, or I can shift gears. And so I decided to like, hey, let's put this thing on the shelf and let's make a minimum viable product. Like a small game. Let's do something small in scope that's more manageable for a first time user. Deck of cards and some bits in a small box, and let's see if we can accomplish this first, right? So I took off a big bite, and then I like backed that up, and then I'm like, let's take a smaller bite the second time around. Um, and that game was heavily influenced by Reiner Knizia as well. The core idea was I played Battle Line, which is one of my favorite small two-player games, and I was like, well, what if Battle Line was a four-player game? And then that's kind of where Bullfrogs came out of. And then pandemic had kind of hit recently, and it has some similarities to the way cities explode, like or viruses explode in pandemic. So that's kind of where that game came from. So that I created, I had the massive canvas of do whatever you want, and then I was like, okay, this here's your canvas now, Keith. What can you do here? Um, and that was by for sure a good idea. you know, um,
So yeah, you set yourself some reasonable
yeah,
constraints so that you could actually produce something rather than toil away for the rest of your life on something that never sees
right.
the light of day type
And I'm
thing.
definitely
Yeah.
I'm production minded, right? So I worked in video
Yeah.
game production, like schedules, like task management, like setting up scopes of things. That's kind of all part of my background. And I was like, well, I should just apply these other skills that I have to this process. And what I considered board games as a hobby, and then I decided to treat it like a job. So I call it I call it a jobby, but where it's like I treated my hobby like a job because I wanted to accomplish something, and if you don't take it seriously, you're not going to get anywhere. So and even at that point in time, like I'd set a schedule for myself where my 9 a.m. to 8 p.m. was like work and family, and then like 8:30 to 2 a.m. was Thunderworks time, and that's when I did all my stuff, and I would do that every day for years. I don't do that anymore. I'm a little older and not as resilient.
Well, you also you have a bit more time during the day now
Right.
since you know.
Yeah. I have different responsibilities, but yeah, that's true. But yeah, you had asked me a question that I wanted to get back to you.
Just in terms of like what prompted you
Right.
to kind of go with bullfrogs, and uh, how did you think about using that as the avatar to launch? So I mean,
I covered a lot of that, but in terms of
yeah,
like
you did.
the just the moment in which I said, "Hey, I'm a board game player. I want
Now
to
I'm a
now I
designer.
want to be a designer," and that comes. Uh, we got to pick that one out. So the main so that comes from some of it comes out of my personality, right? So um, some of that was coming from my early days in video games, was in quality assurance and QA, and that job is all about attention to detail, seeing things, and being able to see what it could be, being able to see like what where are the defects in this, and what changes could be made. So I through that process of having that job for a long time, is that just became part of my brain. So now every time I play board games, even before I started deciding to design something, I'm constantly thinking to myself, how could this be better? How would I do this different? Um, like what would I what I perceive as mistakes? What mistakes were made when they were making this game? And I still do that every time I open up a board game. I was like, oh, they decided to put linen on the tiles, but then they put this over here. I would have done it this way. Um, so it's just a critical mind. And
Yeah.
I think when I see enough board games and I say, oh, I would have done it this way. I would have done it this way. And then at some point I say, well, I should stop talking about how I should do it and just try to do it that way. Because I clearly have an opinion of what the right way to do something is. So that's where that came from. And kind of the ignorance of knowing how difficult it is to publish board games, and the kind of the platter of the Jamie Stegmaiers and the James Matthews of the world kind of telling you how to do it, and this brand new platform called Kickstarter that reduces most of the risk for the creator. Um, and so that, yeah, everything kind of came together, and I was like, well, let's just make some games, and we did. And then once I did one, then the next question is like, okay, what's next? And I can't stop. So
It's kind of like the Dunning-Kruger effect. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
I've heard of it, but I'm not. Yeah.
It's this kind of like double loop of like you climb what's called like Mount Stupid,
Yeah.
where at the you're at the top of that, and you think you know everything,
Right.
out of ignorance, and then you realize how little you know, and you fall into the valley of despair, and then slowly you start to learn and develop, and then eventually you can have some expertise in a field.
Yeah.
But you actually get a lot done on Mount Stupid, when you don't realize that what you're doing is
Right.
is a bad idea. Right?
Yeah, that's very true. That's very true.
When you're thinking of games, do you have a typical process that you go through, whether it's in terms of like an ideation process or an inspiration process, or clearly you like planning things out, but do you just sit down and say, hey, it's time for me to start thinking about a new game, or how does it all work?
Yeah, I mean, I think the process has been different for different projects. I know a lot of game designers will be working on 3, 4, 5 different projects like at the same time in terms of design. I didn't want to do that. I wanted to focus on one thing and just bang my head against it until I figured it out, because I didn't want to split my focus, especially early on. In terms of publishing and manufacturing, I'm definitely working on multiple projects all at the same time. But in terms of design, I usually only work on one game at a time, and then if I end up putting it to the side, and because I don't feel like I'm making progress, I've never actually come back to it before. But I mean, I just told you I might come back to my other project, because I've been planning to. But in general, I don't. I want to move forward to the next thing. Sometimes, usually, I'm waiting for inspiration, but you can't wait forever, right? So, good ideas just come sometimes, and a lot of times, good ideas come from playing other games, playing other prototypes. So when I'm feeling like I want to start working on another game, I just start playing a lot of stuff, more so than I usually do. Um, Sometimes a game comes from a name. So, for example, Goblin Vaults that I designed, and we released last year. Goblin Vaults is a game we released last year. That is my design, and that game came out of just having a title. So there was a reference to a card game in one of our other games called Role Player Adventures called Goblin Vaults, and then there's that whole like game within the game thing. It's like, well, let's try to make that game. So I had a title, I knew it was a card game, and that was my canvas. And so
Great. This should exist. Yeah.
somebody should make this. It might as well be me.
Yeah.
Whereas then, a role player inspiration came out of playing somebody else's game, just playing some role player games, or playing a role playing game, where they had an interesting character creation system, and I said, what if the whole game was character creation and then off to the races, right? So that was a moment of inspiration. Um, and then things like role player adventures and the expansions for role players, those are my designs, but those came from kind of listening to my fans or listening to fans of that genre. This, hey, I want this. I said, oh, well, okay, let's make that. So um, that's where those come from. I mean, I have had other moments of like I just get inspired to work on something. The problem with being a designer and publisher is that finding time to design is very difficult because there's always much more like what's seemingly much more pressing things that are going to directly affect whether I have food on my table. Those end up taking priority. But I do definitely carve out time to do quite a bit. Obviously, I'm playtesting the things that we're publishing. About, it used to be about half of the games that we publish are mine. Now it's probably closer to 40% of the games that we publish are mine. So I work with a lot of designers, and I'm part of that development process. So I still get to kind of use my design muscles in terms of like helping push those games across the finish line. But it's a different process. I actually think I like the development process more than the design process because the designers are like come up with a cool idea. It's like there's a million cool ideas. I have cool ideas. Everybody else has cool ideas. It's a matter of like which one do we go with, and then it's about like just molding that into a game. Just coming up with cool ideas. I work much better in a confined space, like we were talking about. So if I have somebody else's game, or I have a game that we've already been working on, or an expansion for a game, it's easier and more fun for me to come up with how can we change this, how can we tweak it, how can we just really amp up the quality of this title, and then just test it and find out.
And it's a different type of creativity as well.
Yeah.
Like it's exercising other muscles.
For sure.
So you both design games, obviously, for Thunderworks to publish, but you've also designed stuff for other publishers. Are there differences in terms of the process, or at least the way that you've gone about those processes when you know that you're making something for someone else, or what goes into deciding that?
So the stuff that I've designed for other people was mainly Eduardo Braff at Pencil First coming to me and asking me to work on something. There's small projects like single player mode. So there's one point in which I was relatively a little bit well known for designing single player stuff because every Thunderworks title has a single player mode. Obviously, at least the first two of the first three titles from Thunderworks were mine, and they had solo modes. So he would come to me and ask me to work on them, and those are really interesting because the game is done. Like the multiplayer game is done. My philosophy is like I want to emulate the multiplayer game as much as possible. I want to minimize the amount of administration for any kind of AI character, and then I want to have some kind of spark. I want to have some kind of special thing just for the solo game that kind of bumps it up in terms of interest. And so once I kind of established that philosophy, then I have this philosophy. I have this completed game. It's a matter of like it's a puzzle to figure out. Like, okay, where are the point of interactions that I want to simulate? Where are the point of interactions I want to not worry about? What is the cool thing that we could be doing that isn't in the multiplayer to make it feel special? And that's a fun puzzle to solve. And I honestly don't usually spend a lot of time on them. It's usually like maybe a day of design and then 2 days of playtesting. And then I feel like, all right, this is pretty much it. And then I'll hand it off to the publisher and they can do final playtesting. So, I mean, the big difference between publishing my own stuff is like I have to take it to 100%. But the publisher is going to want to change stuff. Ed tends not to change a whole lot of stuff, but and he's got a good design mind as well. So I'll take it as well as I'm going to take it, and then I know he's going to change some stuff, and that's fine. Or he might ask for some changes, and those are happy. I'm happy to do those things. So that's definitely more like a work for hire. I showed up for the gig, I did the job, I went home, kind of thing, and I like that. It's fun. It's versus the games I've designed for, so like Skull Hollow or the sequel Mal Peak. Those, Ed came to me with an outline. He said, these are some bullet points. Here's 6 bullet points that I want you to hit." And I was like, "Well, okay. I'm gonna make the game I want to make. I'll keep these things in mind, but I'm not. This is not my rule of law, right?" So he came to me on that particular game. It was like big monster versus a bunch of little guys, 2-player, asymmetric. He had some other bullet points that I disregarded. So I made the game I wanted to make, and then we did a lot of going back and forth. And he's a real good partner in terms of like uh, he's really he has good feedback and he wants to play test. And at some point, it's interesting when designers come to me with a game. Usually they get it to like what I consider like 85%, and then I have to take it the rest of the way. And like Ed was kind of expecting it to be at like 99% and him taking it the rest of the way. My thought process was like, sweet, I can. He asked me to make this game. I can just make the game and just hand it off and be done. I don't have to do all the publishing stuff, which like marketing and sales and designing, working with the graphic designers and all that stuff. I was like, this will be an easier project. And at that point in time, I didn't have another pressing project to do. Um, but it turned out to be a lot more work than I thought it was going to be. Just because the nature of an asymmetric game is that, especially one that's customizable, the matrix of possibilities of testing is kind of goes through the roof. So that game required a ton of testing, and then especially when we started adding the second game, in which there was double the number of possibilities, the matrix of testing like blew up. Um, and so as that's in terms of my approach, my goal is to take it to a spot and pass it off, and then this unless you need me. Whereas in publishing, I got to own this thing. I'm responsible for its success in the market. That's a much bigger piece. But in terms of like at the end of the day, I still want to make a great game. I still want to make a game that people are going to find fun, that can be successful in the market, and I want that publisher to be successful with the title, just as like I would want to be successful with somebody else's.
But it's often like it's a question of bandwidth as well.
Yeah,
what is the last 10% takes 90% of the time, or
Totally.
it's that kind of stuff.
Very
And
true.
so yeah, and the moment that you have multiple people involved in the different processes, then there are more feedback loops that have to happen and
Right.
more discussions.
That's
and,
it. The multiple people piece of it is interesting because a lot of times designers, at least I see on the Facebook groups and stuff, people will be looking for co-designers or they'll want to work with, their buddies on projects, and like that's something I've tried to avoid at all costs, because I have a clear vision of how I want stuff most of the time. Not always, but most of the time, and I have trusted people that I can ask their opinions for if I get stuck. Whereas if there's multiple voices in the room, like it just feels like moving forward takes that much longer because at some point you're going to have opposite opinions and you're going to dig in and it's going to be a problem. And
yeah.
I want. It's interesting. When I worked at video games, the latest Call of Duty game would come out, and like my name's in the credits. I was one of the 1,200 people that worked on it. There's nothing I could like point at the screen and say I made that. Whereas in the opposite is true with board games. It's like when Role Player came out, it's like I published this thing, I did all the art direction, I designed it, I wrote the rule book, I dropped cases off at my local game store. I packaged them for my customers. I answer their emails. So like I have a real ownership of these things, and it feels great. I mean, when things don't go well, then you also like it's all your fault. But if things are going well, then you get all the glory. And I like that piece of it, of like being part of a team that's like a small cog in a large machine versus like being a big cog in a small machine. It's definitely a change, and it's one that I've been enjoying.
I guess maybe that also kind of explains why developing your own publisher seemed like a little bit more of a natural direction than say, okay, I want to become a game designer. Let me go work for someone else, or let me just develop on spec, or let me go and pitch to a whole bunch of publishers. It feels like that sense of not only control but responsibility of shepherding the game from idea to in the hands of your customers seems to suit your personality better.
I think
like,
so.
How do you explain that?
I think so. I mean, some of when you start designing stuff, there's kind of two main paths. One is publish it yourself, take on all the responsibility, take on all the costs, and then if the whole thing fails, it's on you. And or there's like pitch to publishers, let them use their expertise, and then you can focus on game design, the next big thing. Um, and I mean, most people don't self-publish. And I decided to. Some of it was because Kickstarter was new, and it looked really cool and exciting. But big part of it is I didn't really know how to pitch anything to anybody. Like I was like, I know how to make stuff, but I don't know how to like pitch to people. And I didn't have a lot of connections. I didn't have a network of people I could, at least on the publishing side. I had a lot of friends that were designers, but I didn't have any publishing connections. And I was, a lot of that is going to conventions, doing cold calls, making sell sheets, really selling yourself and your design to people. And I was just scared of rejection. I I didn't want to put my neck out there. Like I was just really nervous about that, and I just believe that if I just do the best I can, I know what's cool, I know what looks good. That if I can make my customers happy, and because hopefully they like the same stuff that I do, then I could see success at the end of the tunnel. Whereas then it's like if I leave my fate up to somebody else, that they've got their own motivations to do things and they've got their own style, and I didn't want to give up control as well. Um, I didn't want to do that. I was like, I can do it. Kind of go
Yeah.
getter attitude. And the other thing is I didn't have a bag full of 20 games that I designed that I'm trying to pitch to people. There's a local designer here in Madison, Wisconsin named King Klenko, who's a friend of mine, and I remember going to Gen Con with him, and he had a big duffel bag of like 7 games that he had designed and was trying to pitch. And I was like, I got my little dice placement game called Role Player, and I focus on one at a time, and it's just I I feel like I have some design talent, but I don't feel like I'm a super prolific designer. I don't have a gazillion ideas. I know how to sharpen a pencil, but I don't know how to make a big old box full of them, right? So um, I felt like that suited me better. Um, but I do sometimes dream of the day of like, well, there's something nice about like passing it off and moving on to the next thing. That you can do a lot of different things, a lot of variety of experiences you can build. There's something attractive about that. So sometimes I wax poetic about the other side of the fence, but I'm very happy doing what I'm doing too. So
And if you were doing it that side, you'd be waxing poetic about doing it all
yeah,
yourself. But so it's interesting that you're kind of your maybe fear of rejection or not knowing how to pitch has ironically led you to a position where you hear a lot of
that's
pitches,
true.
like a lot of them.
Yeah.
So like you hear these like pitches from designers pretty often. Are there like what are some kind of common things that you've seen, whether they are traits or missteps or difficulties or what have you
Yeah.
that game designers who pitch you like often like maybe fall victim to and they don't really realize it and might like hurt them through that pitching process.
Yeah, I think the biggest is like having little understanding of who they're talking to. As a publisher, I get pitches all the time. People trying to pitch me ideas, and like, understand like, okay, I'm talking to Thunderworks. I can see that they publish 2 to 3 games a year. So they're not accepting many. They're not like signing many games. And then I'm also trying to publish a handful of my own titles as well. So my window of potential games to publish is very small. Um, Oftentimes I get pitches. Most pitches are through email. They come with kind of form letter. They don't come with anything specific towards me. Um, a lot of times they don't.
Copy
Yeah,
paste.
a lot of times they don't know the kind of stuff that we publish. So it's like, okay, if you're familiar with Thunderworks, you know that we traditionally do like medium weight euros that include a solo game and We've never done anything like Dexterity
A
Party.
sports game.
Yeah. So if somebody comes to me with like a 3 to 7 player party game, I'm just like, you have no idea. You don't know anything about my company. This doesn't make any sense. So here's the thing about pitches. Oftentimes they're emailed. First of all, you have to have a sell sheet, or I'm not even gonna look at it. And I have to develop these. I have to develop these filters because I get so many of these things. And obviously, we do publish stuff from other designers, so I want to see stuff. But like I have to develop these filters. Like one, it has to play down to solo because all of our games do that. And it that it's an easy thing to filter out because a lot of people don't consider that. But honestly, solo gaming is a big part of our community, and there's a lot of people that that either buy games that have solo modes just because they like the fact that they're there and they could play them, and things like the biggest guild on Board Game Geek is the Solo Players Guild. There's a lot of these people that love these games, so that's always like one of the first filter. Like it has to have a solo mode, and then it can't be like a more social or more casual genre that doesn't feel like it's going to align with the stuff that we've done. And the stuff that Thunderworks has done is basically uh, an imprint of my tastes. These are the kind of games I like.
Yeah.
These are the ones that I'm going to publish. So obviously, there's things like Ten Penny Parks, which is further away, is in a different space than something like Role Player, but they're still kind of games in the hobby space that are medium weight. But anyway, so there's the solo filter I do, and then the sell sheet is critically important. There's it's being able to create a sell sheet for your game is an important skill as a game designer. It's like, here's my game, on a piece of paper. I can present it to you, and then as a publisher, I can see what are the components, so I can see how expensive this thing is going to be. Because I'm thinking about manufacturing, right? So I'm like, oh,
Yeah, of
this
course.
game has 114 dice. That means if I want to publish this game, it's going to have to at least be $70, and it's a party game. It's like, okay, you know, first of all, I don't really like party games, but if it were a party game, a light game, there's a reasonable expectation from customers of the weight, the complexity of the game to the price point of the game, which doesn't make any sense. But that's just the world that we live in, right? So I'm looking at the components. I'm kind of doing an internal calculation of like how much is this going to be to make. So what would I have to price it at? What kind of margins could I make on this game? So it's like, because I'm thinking I'm gonna work on this game for 2 3 years, and then it's gonna come out, and I'm gonna be have a demo staff at conventions demoing this thing, spending lots of money on advertising and all that stuff. It's got to be. That's one of the reasons why it's got to be a game that I like, because if I'm gonna invest this much of myself into it, I gotta love this game, right? Because I'm gonna be demoing it. I'm gonna be talking to salespeople at distributors and tell people how awesome this game is, and if I don't believe it, it's not it's not going to be a very good sales pitch, and I'm not going to feel very good about myself either. So I got to love the game, is a big piece of it, and part of that is the sell sheet has to tell me what the components are, what the hook of the game is, what am I going to be able to use as to market this thing. What are the bullet points on the back of the box? What am I going to use to get people interested in looking at this game versus the other 2,000 games that come out every year? So the sell sheet is important, and then, but most of the pitches that I receive it might be every single game that I've signed. It's had an in-person pitch. So usually my process is that people send me sell sheets. Once I decide like it's interesting enough for me to take a closer look, then I want to set up a meeting at a convention. And so that's tough for like if I'm an Italian designer, what
Yeah.
I currently don't go to any international conventions. I do 4 consumer-facing conventions a year: PAX Unplugged, Gen Con, Origins, and then I've got a local con here in Madison, Wisconsin called Gamehole Con. And then I do 3 business-to-business conventions, which are Gamma Trade Show, which is in Louisville, Kentucky this year, and then ACD Games Day, which is a distributor convention here in town in Madison, and then we also go to another distributor convention. But basically, and then I also go to Protospiels. If you're familiar with a Protospiel convention, it's just designers getting together, playing each other's games, giving each other feedback. It's like super useful that's definitely my highlight of the year is going to Protospiel. There's at least where I'm at. There's one in Madison, Milwaukee, Minneapolis, and Chicago each year, and I go to these things. I see a lot of designers that I know because I've been going to these for so long. We play each other's games, we rip each other's games apart, and at the end of the weekend, you go home, and your game is 200% times better, and you're probably way more inspired than you were when you got there. So, a lot of times I'll get pitches from people at those shows as well. And so everything that I've signed, it's from sitting down with the designer, playing the game, asking questions, because I'm not just learning about this great game. I'm also learning about like how does this person communicate? Like, because I'm going to be working with this person on a regular basis. Like, how do they see, how how are they open are they to changes? Am I gonna if I decide like, hey, I really think this space game should have a fantasy theme? Are they gonna like not be very happy with me?
Throw the toys out of it.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, as a publisher, I can do that, but I don't want to, I don't want to trash someone, like really make the designer angry about what I did to their game. So, a lot of the what games I sign are about not well, finding a great game, which there are great games out there, and I always feel that maybe this is a little maybe I don't know, egocentric, but maybe a little arrogant. But I feel like me and my team can make a good game great if we want to. Um, and so it's about finding a good or great game and then finding a designer that I think is going to be good to work with. Um, and so that's a tough one to do for somebody that doesn't that kind of live in my region of the country or live in the U.S. But so like I was gonna say Lock Up. I published that's from Stan Kordonsky. He's in Milwaukee. We just put Metro Runner on Kickstarter ended a few days ago. That was from a local designer here in Madison. Um, and then I've got another game coming to Kickstarter in June. That's from another designer here in Madison. I mean, Wisconsin has a lot of game designers just because D&D started here and it's cold, so people play a lot of board games. But I tend to sign a lot of local designers because I get to know them before I sign their game.
So, I mean, a lot of this stuff kind of sounds, when you hear it from a publisher, it all makes sense. But it is often surprising how blind people seem to get when it's their baby that they're trying to get out there, shop around, or pitch. And so we're much better at assuming others will kind of understand the way to go than our own. So yeah, that's really really interesting.
It's definitely hard to like work really hard on something, and then hours and hours, and then make a piece of paper and pass it to somebody and say, "Judge this." Like
Yeah.
that's not easy. Um,
But that's the point, right? I mean, like it's not supposed to be easy. So like, or if you keep getting told no, then things like Kickstarter are there for you to then prove them wrong
right.
and
Either prove
go
them
for it.
wrong
Yeah.
or figure out like, just
Your own
take
way.
another look
Yeah.
at it and be like, maybe they're right. Maybe I am going down the wrong path and I should, make a left turn. I think designers oftentimes, well, they don't, I assume they oftentimes don't like think of board games, the business of board games, right? So we, the designers create something out of love and passion and they mold it. And the publisher is thinking, I want to make something good and I make something great, but a certain percentage of the goal of the company is to package up something that can be put on a shelf that can make money so everybody gets paid, including the designer, right? So it's a money making venture. And retail, distribution of retail is even more so, right? Like the further you get from the designer to the store shelf, the interest in what the actual game is goes down and down and down. Um, because they are looking like, I mean, I don't want to, throw shade at retailers or anything like that, but at the end of the day, they're looking for a box. They don't care what it is. They're looking for a box
As
they
long
can
as
put
it
on their
sells.
shelf that somebody wants to come in and take off their shelves and give them money for. Um, and once you've been doing that, because this is the first game a game designer has made, or this is the thing that they've really incubated, versus a retailer, they're dealing with thousands of games coming in every year. So like, what makes this game different than this one? This one sells better. That's really really the difference. And it makes me a little sad to say that, but I get it. They're trying to run a business too. So
But I think with the development of like crowdfunding platforms and independent publishers and kind of the resurgence that general tabletop gaming has enjoyed, there just seems to be more avenues than ever
that's true.
for you to find that group for
Right.
whom your virtual shelf, it would be flying off that virtual shelf, but it's
Right.
just harder to access. So
There's been publishers that have been very successful doing that too, right? There are guys like the Too Many Bones guys up in Minneapolis where they don't sell at retail, right? That's not part of their business model. They sell directly to customers and probably on Amazon in their own store, um, and that's worked great for them. There are those kind of avenues, and then there's also people who like I just have a game that I made that I want to see become created. I just want it to exist, and they go down that path, and then they make the game, and they people like it or they don't, but it gets made and they're happy, and then they move on to other things. And that's another thing that Kickstarter is great for. Is like make this person's dream come true. Their dream isn't to become a game publisher. Their dream is to make this game, and then they've got other dreams they want to worry about, and that's great too.
Keith, thank you so much for taking some time, quite a lot of time,
Yeah,
to share your kind of perspectives and experience and
yeah,
geek out a bit about War of the Ring with me today.
yeah.
If you'd like to find out more about Keith's games and his company, Thunderworks Games, you can find them on Facebook and Instagram with the handle Thunderworks Games. Their newest title, as we talked about, Metro Runner, has just concluded a Kickstarter campaign and will be available for general purchase soon, or you can sign up as a late backer on metrorunnergame.com. You can find and order many of Keith's other games, like the Cartographer series, Role Player Adventures, Tenpenny Parks, and Goblin Vaults at their website at thunderworksgames.com. Keith, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me, man. It's been fun.